Next up, continuing on the theme of collaboration, I'm very happy to introduce Adam Hyde, who's the co-founder of the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation. And over to you, Adam. Do you need to hook in?
Okay, kia ora. My name is Adam Hyde from the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation, known as COCO for short, and I'm just going to briefly run through some stuff that we're doing with regard to publishing in open source. So just a little bit of background about me. New Zealander, now living in San Francisco, and co-founder of Kristen Rattan, who some of you might know of COCO, and also a Shuttleworth Fellow. If you don't know about the Shuttleworth Foundation, it's a very good organization that supports a lot of very innovative social entrepreneurs, and they've done a lot of work in open science and publishing and things. So if you've got a great idea, that's a good place to start if you are looking for some support. So COCO builds open source technologies and communities, and I just want to talk very briefly about this. I won't keep you for terribly long. If you don't know what open source is, just a very brief recap of that. There are basically two different types of software categories in the world. One is open source and the other is closed source or proprietary. Open source means that it's licensed so that you can get the source code and you can do what you want with it, right? So you can just grab it and change it, make it your own. And closed source is where you generally can't get the source code at all, and it's not licensed for reuse. So generally this is like considered as a proprietary closed model. It's very common, you know it very well from a lot of the software products that you use, and especially in publishing. You get a big box platform, maybe a workflow manager, manuscript submission system, and you can't change it. Doesn't mean that you don't necessarily know how to change it, even if you could get the source code, but you're just not permitted to change it. And open source liberates you from these very restrictive licensing agreements so that you can get the source code and change the software to make it as you need it to be. So there are some potential gains of open source. One obvious one, it's for free, so it can reduce the cost of software. As we all know, manuscript submission systems and workflow management systems are very expensive pieces of software, and more or less this market is controlled by a preset, 4 or 5 of them, very expensive. But if you use free software, open source software, then the software itself costs nothing, right? So you can actually reduce the cost of your organizations by that proportion. Of course, you may still wish to have a service provider that looks after you as well, hosts it, and holds your hand through the processes, provides support, but that's another part of the equation. You can at least reduce the cost of the software, and also if you have access to the source code, you can shop around for the right hosting provider, right? So it gives you a lot more freedom of choice. Also, open source, if you do have the capacity to be able to build software, if you have a development team or you know you can afford to buy one or hire in a cheap programmer, then you can change the software and you don't have to rebuild the whole thing. You can just change and add the things that you want, right? So it reduces the costs of getting exactly the software that you need, potentially. I would argue that open source software generally leads to better software. This is a very highly contentious argument. But my argument is based on the fact that in the publishing world with manuscript submission systems, for example, the 4 or 5 big box prescriptive workflow platforms, they give you a workflow, or at least they give you something that you build an organization around, and you staff it to make up for the inadequacies of the software. In open source, the community, the constituents, the major stakeholders of the entire community are involved in the building of and the design of that software. So potentially authors, reviewers, editors, senior editors, chief scientists, everybody can be involved in have a say in what that software can be. So you can potentially get a much better result, in my opinion. Also, if you can get that better software, one that better matches your workflow, for example, within a publisher, then obviously there are some efficiency costs, right? Hopefully, you can put a paper through the system faster. Hopefully, it may reduce some staffing costs because the software is doing a better job. So you can not only reduce the software costs, but the operating costs. You can own your own tools, right? So you haven't ransomed your data to some provider somewhere. You actually own the software. It's free software. Nobody can take it away from you. You can have it forever. You can do what you want with it, and all the data that's housed in it is also yours, as it should be. So you can take it out of that system if you want to and put it somewhere else without having to convince somebody to give it to you at potentially at a princely ransom. And it also potentially opens the door for innovation. And this stands to reason, right? If you have closed source software that nobody can change, nobody can access the source code apart from one organization, then only that organization can really extend it and innovate. But open source software, anybody can get that code and do what they want, right? So it really opens the door for potential innovation by anybody out there. So it really offers the opportunity for the publishing sector to move the sector on, potentially. Whereas the big box platforms are invested in the way that they do things, and it's very expensive to change them, and they're invested in not enabling you to change. They want you to stay within their walls and keep using the same model that they provide you for as long as possible and pay the licensing fees. So they're not likely to innovate any day soon. So I just want to talk very briefly about what we've learned about open source in publishing. And I'll just briefly touch on one of the tools that we make. It's a framework called PubSuite. And PubSuite essentially allows you to build your own workflow for you as a publisher, right? It's not at the stage yet where you can sort of drag and drop things around, in the browser and then make your own workflow. But you could, if you have some development staff, it's a very early software at this stage, then you can piece it together a workflow from existing components, right, to build the optimum workflow, the workflow of your dreams. And this is just a screenshot of some of the workflow components for a journal system. Also, because PubSuite, what it is a framework that allows you to assemble workflows. It's not just journal publishing it's focused on. We also have built book production, scholarly monograph production platforms on top of this, and there's also micropub platforms coming and preprint servers, etc. So the point is that you assemble out of existing components, stuff that other people have built, and then add your own stuff and build your own workflow. So this is just a very high-level diagram of a workflow, the platform for Collaborative Psychology Journal in California, and it's the entire workflow is for processing a document through the review stages, blah blah blah. It consists of these 6 components, and because you can reuse these components, we're partnering with a lot of other very interesting partners and publishers, namely eLife, who are present today in Hindawi, and they are also grabbing PubSuite and grabbing some of the existing components and adding their own components and building the workflow that they want, right? So you don't just inherit somebody else's workflow and you're stuck with it, but you can have your optimum workflow. You can put that together to suit exactly your needs. And this is what Hindawi and eLife are doing. So the main benefit of open source is that it comes from working together, right? So you can imagine if I'm just building an open source software by myself, I might license the code for reuse, but if nobody's really reusing it or contributing to it, I might as well be locked away in a cupboard somewhere under my bed or wherever, right? Or be closed source. There's no advantage there, right? So the advantage comes when other people start using it and start contributing to it. And so if you can imagine, at this moment, the publishing sector is trapped, so to speak, within proprietary software, big box platforms. You can imagine if this entire sector was transformed so that people were working together to build softwares together, open source softwares together, what an effect that would have over this entire industry. It would be massive. So the big question is, how would that happen? How would you actually get publishers to work together, right? Crossref obviously had some experience in this and others. And we're interested in how you do this in order to get publishers to work together to build shared infrastructure together, right? For the good of themselves and the good of publishing at large, including the entire sector. So there are several ways. If you know anything about open source, you'll think about it as primarily as a technology domain, right? It's about source code, open source. And so there are tools out there that you can use to enable you to collaborate with other people. For example, GitLab, which is where developers collaborate, and it's like GitHub, but it's an open source version of GitHub if you know GitHub. Anyway, it's a source code repository that enables developers to work together. And there are also things out there like Slack, where people can communicate with each other. This is a screenshot of Mattermost, the open source version of Slack. And developers and designers can talk together, right? So these are all tools that you can use to collaborate on open source. But the main point is that software isn't primarily a technology pursuit. It's all about community, right? If you're going to work with other people to build shared infrastructure together, then you actually have to talk to each other. Stands to reason, I think. So this is what Cocoa sees itself as doing, much like Crossref, is becoming a trusted facilitator of publishing community to look after a specific thing. In this case, building out workflows, right? Building out optimum manuscript submission systems, publishing systems, scholarly manuscript production systems, all of these things. And bringing publishers together, to talk with each other, to talk about their needs, to learn from each other, to design systems together, and to build them together. And so we've started doing this, right? So this is just a few screenshots of meetings that we've had from around the world. And here is literally a photograph of, photograph, does anyone say photograph anymore? Wow. I just dated myself. So I just dated myself, that's also a really wrong thing to say. Anyway. So this is a photo of a meeting that we had in San Francisco a few months ago. And present here is Eli Fendawi, University of California Press, California Digital Library, and us. And we facilitated this group of people to come together who might not normally have, they're operating in the same sector, but might not have terribly many touch points where they work together. They may have some more than others. But we're bringing them together to talk about designing workflow systems together. And the way to do this is that you have to provide trusted environments for these people to be able to get to know each other and to talk with each other. That's the key to it. It's got nothing to do with technology. You can't work with other publishers unless you know them, unless you trust them, and you can only do that within a safe, facilitated environment at first, so you can get to know each other. There's another photo of another event that we put together actually some months before the previous photo. And this is publishers collaborating around Editoria, which is the monograph production system that we built on top of PubSuite. And this is University of California Press once again, NYU Press, University of Michigan Press, University of North Texas Press, University of Minnesota, University of California Davis Library, and MIT Press. Come together, this is just a shot of a few people from that event, but came together to discuss the future direction of the scholarly monograph production platform called Editoria. And just a few more. Last week in London, Eli Fendawi and Coco getting together to talk about issues around building manuscript submission systems together. So I can flick through these as I talk. I don't have terribly much more to add to this, but just to say that open source can be terribly transformative to this sector. It can change publishing. It can give publishers an optimum workflow, and that can reduce costs. It can make the article travel through the system faster. It can give you control over your data. It can allow you to have all of these things. It can enable you to make your constituents happier, to give better experiences to the authors and reviewers, etc. And the way to do that is through open source and building shared infrastructure. But the secret to it is only partially about the technology. The other part of it is about facilitating conversations in the same room between publishers and generating goodwill so publishers are prepared and willing to work together to this end. And that's it from me. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Miss. Here, you can.
So you talked a lot about publishers. That makes sense given that whether it's book or journal publishers. One of the things that I've talked about in the research nexus is getting the links to other platforms, systems, such as code, software, very important associated resources, right? How does this fit into your framework?
So it fits by having stakeholders from each of those representative organizations being part of this community and bringing the expertise to the table. And so we're hoping in the future, for example, one of the things that we wish to build into one of the production systems we're currently working on is integration with Crossref DOI API, right, for lookups, so that we can actually check references and get the right DOI returned and the right structure of the information. So what we would like to do is invite, for example, Crossref to these events to start talking to us about, and to the larger community about how we could do this together and best practices. So it's all about, once again, about conversation, bringing people into the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, it's great to have Crossref there, but the data, the code, the protocols and so forth, those are also part of your
entire spectrum of the community that sits in front of us.
Okay.
Yep.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I think most successful examples of open source I've seen working are with fairly generic, fairly foundational software, operating systems, databases, web servers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Have you got kind of examples you're looking to that have been successful in more applied spaces and more kind of user-centered services?
Yeah, I think it's a very good criticism of open source that it's often a developer-led solutions provision culture, and there's often developers solving their own problems, which has led to the internet being run on top of open source software. But when it comes to user space, it has largely failed. And but there are good examples out there. I mean, WordPress is an obvious one, right? WordPress runs, according to them, 40% of all websites hosted on WordPress. I wouldn't count WordPress necessarily as a great user experience, but it is a success in this user space. And there are other examples as well. You could count, for example, Firefox. You know, they defined what the browser was going to be and look like, right? So that's another one. So there are examples out there for sure. What we want to do is change open source culture to a degree, and by example, and make sure that the stakeholders, researchers, everybody involved are involved in the discussions of what these systems should do and how they should react to them, to their needs.